And I prefer today watching a properly projected 4K image as opposed to a film print. Digital versus analog, I'll take digital every time.
Welcome to Into the Archives. I'm your host, Jason Wall. This is a show where lively discussions with archivists and preservationists will happen, who will share their stories on saving film, television, and music of the 20th century. We are continuing our conversation with film preservationist Robert Harris this week on Into the Archives. He is joining us by phone from his office in New York. On part one of our interview, Robert spoke about his work on Spartacus, Lawrence of Arabia, and Napoleon. And we're going to continue this journey and speak with him about his work on The Godfather, Rear Window, Vertigo, and My Fair Lady. And that is where we're going to begin today. Now, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but the project restoring My Fair Lady actually started because of a bad review back in the early 1990s of the Laserdisc. Is that correct?
That's correct. Unfortunately, My Fair Lady was in the notorious position of receiving two worst Laserdisc of the year reviews one year after the next.
So on this project, it started on the 18th of January, 1994, the day after the 6.9 Northridge earthquake, which devastated many areas of the San Fernando Valley. And the original elements for My Fair Lady were out in the valley, stored at the old RKO nitrate vault. And on that day, the 18th of January, you guys went down to the vaults to retrieve the negative, right?
Correct.
So what did you guys find? What kind of shape was the vault in after that earthquake?
Jim was in the vaults. If you're going in a nitrate vault, the switch for the light is on the outside. It's not on the inside because you don't want, God forbid, a spark. And you have double doors, one that opens out and one that opens in. And when Jim went down there, he and Mike Hyatt went down. I was actually on my way west at the time. And he got the outer door open, and the inner door was jammed because all of the film, or much of the film, had fallen off the shelves and blocked the door. So he got in his beautiful car and drove back to his home and grabbed what he called a persuader, a 6-foot crowbar, and brought that back to the vaults. And as he used the persuader to open the inner door, you could hear cans, hitting the other sides of the walls as they bend and give way. And he finally gets in there, and that's when another aftershock hits. And cans are falling down off the upper shelves. And he's trying to get out of the way, and the door closes, and he can't get out. He's stuck in there. And I got a call from him, and he said, I'm seeing, all these Charlie Brown films coming down, and they're trying to hit me in the head. And he said, God, if I'm gonna die here, I want to die getting hit in the head by the missing footage from the Magnificent Ambersons. And he said, okay, I'm in here. And I said, well, what do you see? And he said, the camera negatives, the 65-millimeter separation masters, 6-track stereo, 4-track stereo, 35 printing negatives. I said, wait a minute, you've got all of that in a single vault? He said, yeah, everything's here in one vault. And as you know, there is a concept called geographic separation, so that should there ever be some sort of a calamity like, fire, famine, frogs, or even earthquake, you're not going to lose your film. Well, here is a major property in a single nitrate blowout vault, and a floor below, I believe, were monogram nitrates. So he said, what do you want me to do? I said, get the negative out. And he was able to get all of this material in his car. The trunk was filled, the back seat was filled. Mike Hyatt had film in the well under his feet on his lap. And I got a call. He said, well, I just got to Warner Hollywood. They're putting it in an outdoor vault overnight. That's the only place that we can put it. There's no place around. And he said it was an interesting experience because I came back on the freeway with my entire suspension system bottomed out.
From all the way to the 65.
From all the weight, yes. I arrived, I think, the next day, and we went back to the vaults, and you were out there at the time, so you remember the earthquake. There was not a truck to be had.
Correct, yeah, that's
right. You know, young archivists, they have these shiny ideas of doing everything perfectly, and you have, air-conditioned, bulletproof trucks to move camera negatives. No, it doesn't work that way. Jim was able to find, and I don't remember whether it was a gardener's truck or a pool cleaner's truck, and he got that, and we took it out to the vaults and loaded all of the separation masters in it because we didn't want them there. And I think we took some of the tracks with us at the same time, and we took those to the Academy archive, which was then at the La Cienega location. It was an odd situation because we arrive, we go in the parking lot, and it's like, where's the film? And we point to this truck with a tarpaulin on it. You're moving the separations for My Fair Lady in a gardener's truck with a tarpaulin? Yep. But we eventually got materials to where they were supposed to be and protected, and of course then the fun began.
Well, let's talk about that fun on My Fair Lady. Unlike Spartacus or Lawrence of Arabia, this film really didn't need any heavy reconstruction work locating missing footage or scenes to cut back into the film. But being a very popular film, like Lawrence of Arabia, all 70mm prints came from the original camera negative, which I assume caused some serious wear and tear to the negative. So how much material was damaged, missing from the negative of My Fair Lady? And any kind of estimate how many times the OCN was actually printed off of back in 1964?
150 times, plus separation masters, plus matrices. We had no original negative on reel 8A or 8B. I was able to get the original bill of lading and all the paperwork from the move in 1970 or 71 from Warner Brothers to the CBS vaults in Radford. There were about 200 cartons that were moved, and almost immediately the things that whomever accepted them at CBS thought they didn't need got junked, like the dupe of the main title sequence. Why would you need a dupe? Well, you'd need the dupe because the main title sequence was a dupe.
So the main title sequence was not on the front of reel 1A of the OCN?
No. They very seldom are in large format because you print the title rolls for whatever language you're producing.
So for the restoration, the main titles came from the separation masters.
Correct. We had the separation masters, and we did a test of the masters, and they were really ugly. They had a lot of dirt built into them. There were registration issues. So enter Chris Reyna, and he created, well, basically he put together everything that we needed that was digital on the film, or did the analog end of it. And in doing the analog end, we ran the separations. He selected a clean frame of each title, each background, because you have titles dissolving, then reconfigured them, printed out in VistaVision, because we couldn't do it in 65, an interpositive, took that interpositive and created a new 65 dupe negative by doing 50% exposures, rocking, rolling, going back and forth to get moving grain, and created a new title sequence, which looked beautiful and clean, albeit a tiny bit soft, but it was far beyond what anyone's expectations would have been at the time. I mean, he and his people just did magnificent work, and he's still working in large format, as you know.
Yes, he is. I ran into Chris a few months ago at The Real Thing. Always good to see him. He's a really good guy, and yes, he does fantastic work. Now, the camera negative, the OCN of My Fair Lady, was used for the body of the photochemical restoration, but at that time it was slightly about 30 years old back in 1994. So what issues did you routinely have to address during the printing process? And I assume that the negative was in A/B roll format?
The film was actually cut in auto select at that time. It was cut as though it had been Technoscope, 2 extra frames at every shot. The splices were opening as they had wanted to be, and normally as you're printing, if the edge of a splice catches, it will cup in the printer and it'll just tear down the middle. And of course, it always happens on the wrong shot, and on this one, it was Audrey coming down the stairs in her ball gown. So we had to go to dupe on that one. And there were enough problems, at least to my eye in the 94 restoration, that when there was an attempt to bring it to Blu-ray and that failed, that I was brought in again by Ken Ross of CBS and was able to fix everything that I wasn't able to fix in 1994 with an 8K scan of the camera negative, 8K scan of the separation masters. We were actually able to go back to the original 6-track mag and capture audio from that. Everything except one reel survived, fill in some frames that had been missing, minor things like that. But now it's just glorious in 4K.
And the Blu-ray came out for the 50th anniversary, correct?
It came out for the 51st anniversary.
Well, I guess better late than never. Now, this is a film that you restored twice, about 20 years apart. In those 20 years, for the negative, how much additional color fading happened, if any, during that period that you noticed?
It had been properly kept. There was differential fading, left and right around the perfs. We had some fading around splices. Strangely, there was some fading head and tails of some shots. So in the digital domain, I was able to fix that. This was all done at Photochem. We were able to literally do dissolves within shots to do the fixes.
Well, the fading issues at the end of those shots, was that caused by the fill footage from the auto select wrapped around the negative in those sections?
No, I don't know why it happened. I'm thinking, this is conjecture, that there might have been a loose wind and it just oxidized around the splice. Because in 1994, we put in, because of the Technoscope, we were able to resplice the entire camera negative. Oh. So we had new splices everywhere. And the tear, that major tear, actually occurred before we put in the new splices.
My Fair Lady was issued on Blu-ray in 2015 by CBS. And then in 1994, the photochemical restoration was re-released in 70mm, handled by 20th Century Fox, if I remember correctly. The ownership of this film has always been somewhat interesting. The film was originally produced by Jack Warner, funded by and released by Warner Brothers in 1964, but today the film is owned by CBS. I know that CBS originally invested something like $500,000 in the Broadway show back in 1955-56, but how does CBS own the rights to the film today?
Well, as I recall, they wanted CBS bought the show so they could get the original cast album. So they owned it, and they cut a deal with Jack Warner, I believe for $5 million, and then the film cost another $7.5 million or something like that. And Warner only had it for, I think, 7 years. And then copyright, elements, everything reverted to CBS. Extraordinary deal for CBS. Smart people.
Oh, yeah, that is a hell of a deal that CBS made on My Fair Lady. Now, thinking about ownership and deals, that actually comes into play on the next two titles you and Jim restored, Vertigo and Rear Window. Alfred Hitchcock's deal with Paramount, which I believe was negotiated by Lou Wasserman back in late 52, early 53, that the ownership of all titles Hitchcock directed, outside of To Catch a Thief for whatever reason, released by Paramount, the ownership of those films would revert to Hitchcock 8 years after their original domestic release. So along with Vertigo and Rear Window, You had Trouble with Harry and the 1956 remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much. Those films, the ownership of those films went to Hitchcock 8 years later, and they started coming into his control sometime around 1962. I believe Rear Window was the first one, and the last one would be Vertigo in 1966, doing the math in my head real quick. So when these films came back into his personal control, how were these films treated and cared for? Was it better for the films, or was it worse for the films than, say, just staying at Paramount back at that time?
They were treated not by a vault staff or an archival staff, but they were treated by attorneys and business people who understandably didn't want to pay for storage. So when the films reverted to Hitchcock, and we have the paperwork on this, a letter went out from his people that said, take the original camera negatives, the separation masters, a 16 millimeter track negative, optical, a 35 millimeter optical track negative, and I don't remember, it was 5 or 6 16 and 35 millimeter prints of each title, and junk everything else worldwide. Audio stems, trims, outs, all original mag tracks, DMEs, 3 stripes, everything. All the original mono mixes, everything went. Everything went.
You know, hearing this from you, Robert, is truly unbelievable what sort of damage happened to these films, all because of penny pinching. But on the other hand, I'm not surprised, now learning that it was lawyers and business people overseeing these films. But what's maddening, and there's a lot that is maddening to this story, is that Hitchcock was a very wealthy man in the mid-1960s. I believe he was the third largest stockholder at Universal, and money wasn't an issue for him. But it's just tragic to learn today that key original elements for these films were junked just because they wanted to save a few bucks on storage back in the 60s and 1970s. Now, Vertigo was the first of 2 Hitchcock films that you restored with Jim Katz. You had a relationship with Tom Pollock of Universal, thanks to your work on Spartacus, and Universal now owned these films. So how did the restoration of Vertigo begin? How did this project start for you?
It began when Jim Katz bought the license for Universal Classics, and discovered that he couldn't make anything. Basically, he ended up with an old faded IP and dupe negative, and that's what they put out in 1983. And that was troublesome. So we were able to bring in the camera negative, and this was then, 1996, I guess? And the camera negative was faded enough that if printed in the analog world, it would not print. And the separation masters were shrunken enough so that they would not print. So we ended up making a VistaVision interpositive, and this was Pacific Title again, Phil Feiner, which they basically baked. They over-processed and were able to get some of the color back into it. Color which now you can pull out to a reasonable extent digitally by grabbing the yellow dye layer and pulling it up by its bootstraps, which also adds grain.
Now, Vertigo was shot on the worst era of 52-48, correct?
Yes, correct.
The worst era, which fades horrendously, a stock that I know very well from my restoration work. But the 1996 restoration of Vertigo in 70mm for me was simply breathtaking because I had only seen the film on VHS in the 1980s, but seeing that in 70mm was glorious. But for the sound, we know that the stems were junked. So where did those original stereo music tracks turn up for Vertigo? What was used for the restoration?
Well, back in 1994, when we were first discussing the Hitchcock films, we went to Paramount, and Paramount had in their music vaults all of the original music stems that they had neglected to destroy. The problem with them was that they were in full vinegar syndrome and had shrunken. We were able to take the tracks from VERTIGO, which we tested, and they would not run normally, and at night we ran them on dubbers, sprocketless dubbers, at Warner Hollywood to try and get the stereo off them, and we're reasonably successful. The major tool was Mike Hyatt's thumb holding the film to the maghead while I poured film cleaner over it.
Very high-tech, Robert.
Yeah, extremely high-tech.
Well, you had the vinegar issue to contend with, but another issue with the tracks is kind of interesting, where about half of the score was recorded in stereo and the other half in mono. So how did that actually happen back in 1958?
Well, it began during the musician strike in L.A.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than record in L.A., and they needed to record, they went to London. And they recorded about, as you're correct, 40% or 50% of the film in London in 3-track stereo, at which point the London musicians went out in league with the American musicians. So they went to Vienna, and the rest of the score was recorded in Vienna monorally.
Okay.
When we listened to the tracks, the protection tracks that we had made from the originals, and we ran them for Pat Hitchcock, we ran them for Herbie Coleman, who was the Hitchcock's producer on a lot of his films.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone in the Hitchcock group said, you have to use the stereo. You know, Bernard Herrmann Music off original mag recordings in 3-track stereo. You're seriously, who would not use them?
And you did use those. So the track needed to be rebuilt to showcase the stereo music. So take us through the process of reconstructing the audio with just a comp mono track of the entire film, no stems, around half of the score recorded in stereo. And how did you get to a 6-track DTS 70mm mix on VERTIGO?
What we had was a 35mm print from which we harvested an overall track, dialogue, music, effects, and then we had the music. The sound department at Universal went about extracting the dialogue because there was no dialogue track, and we started dropping in stereo music, but they also had to remove the effects. So the effects also needed to be removed.
Mm-hmm.
When the effects were removed, you had to re-effect the entire film. New Foley, new effects, everything. Unfortunately, we had a bit of a disagreement, and the sound department decided they wanted to make it bigger.
Yeah.
They added effects which shouldn't have been there, and we were unhappy about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we were actually able to pull it back a bit. You know, that was what it was.
Well, the stereo track has become controversial over the years, and most people are unhappy with the new Foley, as you were saying, which is over the top in sections. And I have seen and heard original prints in mono, and of course the 70mm DTS 6-track version many times. But being a purist, I prefer the mono mix. Yet hearing the Bernard Herrmann score in stereo and seeing the film presented beautifully in restored 70mm is pretty damn cool as well. So I'm going to give the stereo track a pass. So there's my wishy-washy opinion of the stereo track. So anyhow, while prepping for our interview, I was remembering the first Hitchcock film I experienced in the theater, which was Rear Window in 1984. It was co-featured with the Sam Peckinpah film, The Osterman Weekend. God knows why that was a double feature, but it was. But like Lawrence of Arabia, it was really a key experience for me. It was the first film where I was completely sucked into the movie as an audience member, more so than Star Wars, more so than Raiders, or any of the contemporary films of that time. And when it was announced that you and Jim were going to restore Rear Window in 96, 97, I was over the moon. Now, Rear Window also had its share of issues with the negative, and one of them, I was somewhat surprised to learn that the camera negative was used to make all the prints from back in 1954. So I always assumed it went out dye transfer Technicolor originally, but it didn't. So how many times was the negative used to make release prints?
About 300 times.
Damn, that's insane. So why did Rear Window not go out and dye transfer back in 1954?
Remember, Technicolor could only manufacture a certain number of prints, and you get in line. And I, as far as I understand it, they didn't have the ability to make the 300 prints that were needed, so they just went off direct positive, and the negative was pretty much trashed. I mean, we're talking about broken perfs, I-beam splices, replaced shots, and Rear Window being before wetgate printing, it was lacquered.
So it was lacquered by the lab to fill in scratches and digs and whatnot.
Right, to fill in and protect it.
Yeah.
And you would then have to delacquer it after 30 or 40 prints and relacquer it and delacquer it. And at one of the delacquerings, and I believe it was Reel 5A, they removed part of the yellow dye layer. And if you look at one of the early video releases, even on Laserdisc, you can see that the entire reel has yellow speckles and blobs running through it.
Well, there's that great shot of Grace Kelly, her introduction into the film, where she leans down and kisses Jimmy Stewart in the wheelchair. I know that scene had the same type of issues, the yellow speckles, as 5A, with the yellow layer being stripped off the emulsion. So what was the process at that time, back in the late 1990s, in the photochemical world, to replace and restore a yellow layer back into a film like Rear Window?
Rear Window was the first film for which we actually tried replacing dye layers. And this came out of a lunch, I don't remember the name of the restaurant, a little Italian restaurant near Paramount, with Phil Feiner, Jim, and me. And we were discussing the problem, and I said, I wish there was a way that we could drop a new yellow dye layer in. And he said, well, why don't we try dropping in the yellow master and see if we can get it to fit. Now, what your listeners need to realize is that sometimes separation masters are done optically, sometimes they're contact, and you can have sizing differences. So you literally have to make something fit. And his people, I don't remember whether it was Vince Roth there at the time or whomever, was able to get it like 95% as they were with Reel 5A, and did it digitally. And by then, digital had come a long way, and they were able to clean it up, drop in the yellow dye layer. But those were the major problems. And then getting the whole thing back to dye transfer, at that time it was an experimental process, and they were still having problems getting reasonably critical focus. Not that dye transfer was ever sharp, because it wasn't. It had to hire a multitude of sins, or hide a multitude of sins. But the prints that came off in dye transfer, the final ones, were just gorgeous.
You know, I actually forgot that your restoration went out in dye transfer. I knew that the 62 reissue of Rear Window was issued in dye transfer, but the restoration, it simply... I forgot about that. I know Gone with the Wind and Apocalypse Now Redux, Bullworth, Toy Story 2, and a handful of others went out in that new dye transfer process, but I forgot about Rear Window. This film, Rear Window, had such a wonderful color elegance to it. Each apartment really had its own color palette, and the overall use of color throughout the film might not be as flashy from a color perspective as a Vertigo or my favorite Hitchcock picture, North by Northwest, but Rear Window is really a stylish film, and I applaud you and Jim for the final restoration because it looks absolutely gorgeous. Now, since the Hitchcock titles had limited sound elements, I'm assuming that the restored track that was used for the 2000 restoration was sourced from either a print or an OSTN, correct?
The audio came from and this is interesting, apparently the optical printing negative was damaged early on. I don't know whether it's crimped or whatever, but we worked from one of Hitchcock's prints, which was an original 1953 print, so it was, as I recall, complete, but as you probably know, some of the early tracks had two impulses. This is one of them, and one of them was out of focus. So basically, we took our audio from half of the optical audio stream from an original print. Universal Sound Department is great, and they were able to extract audio from it that I don't know how they did it, but they had some digital tools, and it worked.
Well, after Rear Window, but before the Godfather trilogy, there are two titles which you oversaw restorations on, which I always overlook and forget. But one of these is a film that I saw as a kid a handful of times in school via 16mm dye transfer, which starred a very young Jack Lord. That's my memory of this movie, because Hawaii Five-0 was on and there's Jack Lord 25 years earlier. What was the name of this one?
We had Williamsburg's Story of a Patriot.
Yes, that's it.
Which, again, the camera negative that was totally worn out and faded, and which ran in a unique theater at Colonial Williamsburg, which I believe is now shut down recently, which is a pity, in VistaVision, from the camera negative, 6-track magnetic audio. A special formulation done of mag striping, Fox Perf, VistaVision stock, specially made up.
Well, I knew that this film showed in 8-perf VistaVision, but I had no idea it was also 4-track mag, so that's very interesting. Now, the Williamsburg film is not owned by a Hollywood studio, but it was produced, or it had some kind of attachment back in 1957 to Paramount. Bernard Herrmann wrote the score. I know it was directed by George Seaton, who is famous for directing Airport, Miracle on 34th Street, and one of my favorite movies of the 1960s that stars James Garner, Rod Taylor, and Eva Marie Saint, called 36 Hours. But how did you get involved in the restoration of the Williamsburg film? Did you contact them? Did the copyright holders contact you? So how did this film get restored?
It began in 1994 when I took my son to see it. It was his first trip to Williamsburg, and you have kids now, so you'll understand this. All the way to D.C., I was going on and on about the wonders of VistaVision and how it was going to look on this huge atmospheric screen that didn't have maskings. It just kind of fades into a fog. Quite extraordinary. And we got there, and it goes on, and there is this 70mm print out of registration. And you know when a kid has been listening to stuff on and on and on, and they see something and it's not what they heard, they will turn and give you one of those looks like, "What are you smoking?" And I got out of the film, I went to the booth, and I said, what, huh? And I met the lead projectionist, who was wonderful, and he said, "No, you need to call Richard McClooney at Colonial Williamsburg Productions." And I got a hold of him, and we met later in the evening for tea somewhere, and we determined that we were going to save the film. They just had to raise $1 million. It took 11 years to get it going, and then it took about 9 months to get the entire process through. The scanning took a month, and then you're recombining and coloring, and we colored on a little 15-inch monitor. It was the early days of digital color, and that was again faded camera negative, and we put back the yellow layer and worked from the separation masters, and the stereo tracks on that were still quite good, but that was actually a reconstruction. We added back some footage that had been deleted for some reason.
When this reconstruction was completed, were your restoration elements and your screening print for the theater in 8-perf VistaVision, or was this like Vertigo with a 65mm workflow?
We went out to a Vista IP because we couldn't record 65 at that time, and then did an enlargement from the Vista IP to 65mm dupe in 185, and the prints were all 70mm.
So Rear Window and My Fair Lady both had digital restoration work in them, but your first end-to-end digital restoration title turned out to be Williamsburg. And your next project that you restored was also in the digital domain, was the 1972 Best Picture winner,
No,
The Godfather.
next was To Be Alive for the S.C. Johnson Company.
Oh, okay.
In 3-panel, and it wasn't Cinerama. It was 4-perf, 35, 3-panel, left, center, right, and it was produced for the New York World's Fair for S.C. Johnson's exhibit. All the footage did not survive an original camera negative either, so that was, interesting, but more of the same, and they were wonderful, and they wanted to save their film, and they supported it. And it interested me because it was 3-panel, and it's a beautiful tone poem, is what it is. It's glorious film. And then came the Godfather films.
I was kind of pushing ahead there, Robert. Sorry about that. Now, the restoration of The Godfather that you oversaw, I believe, is one of the key restorations in the late 2000s that helped change the perception in the public eye that films between, say, Bonnie and Clyde, 2001 Space Odyssey, up until Star Wars, Raging Bull era, could also be in danger. There was more of a focus on films before that era that needed to be restored because of negative fading and edits and mistreatment and nitrate decomp and all of that stuff. But to preservationists like myself, like yourself, and others who are listening, knew differently. Yet there was still somewhat of a misconception in the public eye that films between 1967, 68 to 1980 had any sort of serious issues because they were viewed as modern, contemporary, new Hollywood, and there would be no risk at all to the negatives or to the films themselves, which is completely untrue. The problem of this era actually hit my radar sometime in 1997. I'm doing math quickly in my head because I believe that's when the 25th anniversary reissue of The Godfather came out. And I saw it, and I was simply shocked how bad that film looked in the theater.
So was everybody else. It was the blacks were green.
A very lovely shade of green, which were completely incorrect for this film. But leaving the theater on the 25th anniversary, I chalked it up to being a badly timed print. And then I saw it again in another theater with a different print, and I saw the same exact issues. Then I heard later whispers that the negative had problems. Never was clear on what they were, but of course, more popular the film, the worse shape the negative could be in due to overprinting. So was that the major problem with the negative of The Godfather, overprinting, or was it a combination of many issues?
Well, that's correct. The more popular film, the worse condition it's going to be in. But the problem with The Godfather was that the original set of prints were dye transfer. So it was fine at that point, conceptually at least. But then came The Godfather 2 and the reissue of The Godfather in 1974-75, and they needed more prints. They rejuvenated all the dye transfers that they could find, which started those on the road to vinegar syndrome, and then needed to print more. And the original camera negative had been cut as auto-select. There was only one lab in Hollywood that could print it, and they ran a ton of prints off the camera negative that way, and then decided to recut it to A and B rolls, and the company that recut it, which shall go unheralded, cut the A and B rolls using soundtrack, negative, print, anything that they could find that was basically, I would say, on the floor as the fill leader. They also had to re-encode all the dissolves and the fades. And there's one gorgeous fade in the film that runs, I think, 12 or 16 feet. And they basically took the film and made everything a 6-foot dissolve. When we begin a restoration, we acquire an original print, and we create a continuity. There's a gentleman who was at ProTech who was doing he does all of my film inspection. His name is Joe Carrick-Kappa. And we measure out everything, length of the shots, cumulative length, shot by shot by shot by shot. So we know how things are working. We measure the fades. We measure the dissolves. We will then go to the cutting cards and the lab cards and confirm all of this information, which gives us even more information. And once we have that, we're ready to begin. Well, the lab that cut the A and B rolls decided, wait, here's a little mark on the edge of the film. That's telling me there's a dissolve there. Well, at some point, there might have been, back before the film was completed, so they actually added a dissolve that was never in the film before. Welcome to the 25th anniversary. That's what we were working with. Lots of dupes. One entire reel 1B was missing in its entirety, and that was a dupe. It goes on from there.
So you had these issues with the camera negative, but you also had issues with the separation masters, very similar to what you found on Spartacus. But unlike Spartacus, where you had different versions of the film depending on whatever reel you were working on, The Godfather was, what, a pre-release version or an alternate cut in the separation masters?
Yeah, well, they were conformed for an initial cut of the film before it was completed. Well, I think what a lot of, and I find this all the time with archival students, you ask them, what's the purpose of separation masters? And they all raise their hands and say, I know. They're made to preserve the film forever. Well, no. The basic premise of separation masters was to stop production insurance. The secondary use is a preservation element. The reality of the situation is that we had separation masters on the film, but it wasn't the final film. It had extra sequences that weren't in the film, and it was missing sequences. And this is where we go back to that wonderful 25th anniversary again. There's the sequence when, I'm just trying to think exactly, it's a fall sequence. It takes place supposedly in New Hampshire or Vermont. And it's Al Pacino meeting with Diane Keaton, and there are leaves blowing and, wonderful things going on. And there are three cuts to Diane, and they're kind of medium close-ups. Those were all field enlargements in the final prints. But the separation masters had medium shots. And there was a shot that needed to be replaced or that was heavily damaged or whatever. And for the 25th anniversary, they went back to the separation masters and cut the wrong shot in.
And again, welcome to the 25th anniversary version of The Godfather. So on your restoration, I assume you went back to the separation masters, made the field enlargements digitally, and then just dropped them back in?
We found the original camera negative, less, I think, a frame on either side where it had been cut out, did a field enlargement, dropped it back in. But, there are all sorts of things that you're doing where you have missing frames. A couple of examples. There is a shot overlooking, I believe, a garden or a wading pool, or in the waltz, the John Marley sequence. You see the same shot twice, but the second time in the film, it's not a wonderful dupe, and although we wouldn't normally do this, it looked so bad that we went back and ran the same shot again, and we needed a bit more footage, so we got to a certain point and ran it backwards, or just duplicated footage, which, hello, digital. There's another sequence in the hospital, when Brando's in the hospital, and you know that people are coming to kill him. And the sequence, this specific one, begins with the camera looking up some stairs. You see Al Pacino backing into the shot with the hospital bed and the nurses helping to push it. We were missing the beginning of that shot. It was just heavily damaged. So we were able to go into the trims and find the slate and the beginning of that shot, and digitally you just cut it in. Another sequence, Marlon Brando's death in the tomato garden. You have the kid running off-screen, I forget whether it's off-screen right or off-screen left, and the trees are blowing, and there's a very long dissolve, I believe, to the cemetery. That was damaged in the recutting to A and B roll, and because they cut all of those dissolves down to a normal length, they cut the footage off and threw it away. You see, we were able to get it to a point where the kid goes off-screen and we had enough footage that we could reverse it and duplicate that footage enough to get us through to the B side of the dissolve.
You've worked in photochemical restoration and digital restoration. Which one do you prefer?
Digital makes your work easier because you have many more tools, but we used to joke that I would arrive at Warner's at MPI in the morning, and they would turn on the equipment, and all the lights would dim in Burbank. You probably noticed that in your office.
Yes, I did.
And it's wonderful. I love digital. Your only limitations come in the analog world. The problems, which are not digital problems, come from extant elements, wear and tear on the elements, fading of the elements, junking of elements. But digital versus analog, I'll take digital every time. And I actually, heresy, I know, I prefer today watching a properly projected 4K image as opposed to a film print. By the way, we did have problems making prints of The Godfather because the data is perfect. When it came to printing, and we did record out all 3 films, the normal Kodak stock would not give us a black that was quite heavy enough, and we didn't want to go ENR. And the Premiere stock was too black, and it ate up just a bit of fine shadow detail below black. And I remember I ran, 93 is the Premiere stock, I believe, and Gordon felt that didn't do it, and the 83 didn't do it. So he wasn't happy with either of them on film. I wasn't happy with either of them on film. But the data is the way that it will always be seen from now on, and he and I understood that. The data was fine. So that's the way to see The Godfather is 4K.
Well, if the late Gordon Willis says that's the way to see The Godfather, you can't argue with that. But for The Godfather 2, did you have the same sort of negative issues that you had on the first film?
Not as bad. All the prints were dye transfer, once again, and we did have some dupes. The main title backgrounds were missing because of the additional films that were done for TV and home video, The Godfather Saga, The Godfather Epic, Abbott and Costello Meet the Godfather. And the main title sequence were dupes. The originals were gone, and these were CRIs, and they were faded. And we went through 200 cans looking for the main title backgrounds to redo them, but never found them. Most of the things in Godfather 2 came from the necessity to eliminate detail, because if you're printing from a camera negative to matrices to dye transfer, you're probably losing 15% of the resolution of the film. Dye transfer is not sharp. Dye transfer is soft. It looks sharp because you have apparent sharpness due to contrast, but there's no real sharpness. It's gorgeous. It's velvety. There's never been anything like it, but it is what it is. So we were dealing with wires pulling back people as they're shot. So we did a lot of digital wire removal in that. But, grading was a problem. We were able to add back the original intermission, which I'd never seen before. And, it's a beautiful film. I think in many ways it's a better film than The Godfather.
For The Godfather 3, a film that was released in 1990, about 17 or 18 years old when the restoration of the trilogy started, is it safe to assume there wasn't many issues with that film and it was pretty much okay?
It had its own difficulties in that it has quite a few dissolves in it and fades, and many of those dissolves were very dirty. The way that they were made, I don't know what happened, and one of them had scratches, literal emulsion scratches, running through it. So in some of them, I was able to go back in and look for production footage and pull the original material that was used to make the printer function dupes. and we went back and scanned those elements and added them. But it's when you have the budget and when you have the ability to do something correctly, you can. I mean, other times you don't, and you know this.
Oh yeah, very true, Robert. Budgets and time are really a luxury that you don't always have on restorations. But I got to tell you, I'm always thankful when the stars line up and that happens. But on the Godfather films, I'm curious, were all three films in a 2K workflow or were they all 4K workflows?
Oh, it's 4K. It was the first 4K color film to be fully restored digitally. And I have to give Grover Crisp credit here, because concurrently in New York, he had Dr. Strangelove being scanned in 4K.
And that was being done at Cineric, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, Balazs and the team at Cineric do great work. And Grover's had some wonderful restorations from Cineric, as well as Sean Belston at Fox. Now, after The Godfather, you went to work reconstructing one of my all-time favorite films. Matter of fact, it is on my list of top 5 favorite films of all time. The 1963 Stanley Kramer comedy, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. 4 mads, I got it right. Now, this was the first of a handful of epic-sized comedies of the 1960s. Mad World was shot in Ultra Panavision 70mm. It was a big roadshow film. And like Lawrence of Arabia, it was cut early on in its roadshow run. The negative and separation masters were conformed to the shorter version. And from 1964 on, the shorter version is how the movie was seen. Sometime in the late 1980s, early 1990s, United Artists found a mixture of positive trims and footage from 70mm prints that appeared, to my eye, that were lifts out of a roadshow release print. And they released it on Laserdisc. So they took the general release version and these clips, mixed them together and released it on Laserdisc. And it turned out not to be the roadshow version, but it was like, I don't know, some sort of version?
Yeah, it is. It is some sort of version, the same way that the Alamo is some sort of version, which is not, it just happens to be not the roadshow version.
Correct. I mean, these are interesting versions of those films, but they're not the roadshow versions. Now, in 2010 or so, you became involved in reconstructing the roadshow version of Mad World. The negative of the trims had been lost, so you had to utilize the 70mm print material that was found 20 or so years before. So 2 questions. Physically, what sort of shape were those trims in? And what was your guide to ensure that the reconstruction would be the original roadshow version and not another oddball variant?
Well, the 70mm material was, much of it was vinegar, shrunken, would not run through any sort of scanner. So sometimes we just let it run off, and it would go to the edge of the films, and you see the mag track. But again, it starts with continuity. It starts with cutting notes from the long version or the short version, trying to figure out where things went. You then need to know what kind of audio you have. So we had some of the mag in complete reels, some of the trims, and this is one situation on the Blu-ray where we did fill in a sequence, a very famous sequence with stills, because that's basically what we were doing. It was, you've heard the term quick and dirty. This was slow, long, tedious, and dirty. Basically putting everything in that we could to accurately represent the original version of the film. There were more shots that were not in the film that were in early test screenings of the film, which never belonged in it in the first place, and some of those ended up on the Laserdisc. So, some people will see things that they've never seen before on the Criterion Blu-ray, and other people will say, wait, what happened to this? What did they do with it? Well, we didn't want it because it wasn't in the shot, that it wasn't in the version that was run at the Dome.
Now, the 70mm trims were completely faded, red, pink. Enter your favorite Eastman color hue here. So explain to us the technology you and your team used to return the color back into this footage on the Criterion Blu-ray, or for the Criterion?
The way that we brought the color back was that MGM had supplied the Laserdisc master, and we scanned the 70 millimeter trims, took them down to black and white, and then lay in the 480i color on top of the 1080p black and white image. The original transfer was done at Crest back in, I guess, the 80s or the early 90s, whatever it was. And their unit, which I believe was a converted rank, I don't remember correctly, the chip on it couldn't get the entire 70 millimeter frame, but at least you could get the information that was on the 70 millimeter print. And the question came up, do we leave the edges, all four sides of the frame, in black and white and just do the, what we have in color, or do we crop it? And my feeling was, no, you leave it in black and white because this is long, slow, and dirty.
So how long did the entire process of this long, slow, and dirty reconstruction and restoration take?
Well, the whole process was a couple of years because we prepped for a reconstruction. Joanne and Lawson and I, my assistant, in the cutting room, we were going through all of these trims and trying to figure out where they went. And then we had the cutting notes, and you've got to use the cutting notes to try and work backwards because it tells you what was cut, but the footages don't relate to the actual film. It's an odd situation. So that was months and months and months just trying to create a continuity.
So the reconstruction research was a few years, but what about the digital restoration and reconstruction side? How long did that take?
It was only 6 or 8 weeks, I think, at Photochem, and MGM did a beautiful job of the transfer, which was used for the Criterion disc. Beautiful job.
Well, Robert, our time is almost up, but I'd like to ask you one more question before we go. And I know what your answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So what is your holy grail title that you would like to reconstruct and or restore?
The one that I would love to do is the Alamo. And for whatever reason, MGM, for the moment at least, is saying no. I would have to raise the funds, for which I would be, coming to the Wall Foundation, and we'll see if sometime in the near future they're willing to revisit that. But other things that I would love to see fixed, even if I'm not doing them, I'd love to see the original 137 shots that are missing from Gone with the Wind added back. I would love to see things like El Cid. That would take a new image harvest, and it would be gorgeous. Little things.
Well, this interview isn't a little thing. It's been 2 shows, almost 2 hours. And Robert, I simply can't thank you enough for sitting down and sharing your stories about your career and all the fantastic restorations you've worked on. And again, your work inspired me back in the 1980s, which led me into this wacky career of film restoration and preservation. And this is
again, for that, you have my most sincere apologies. I'm sorry.
Well, I went bald and gray faster all because of you, Robert, so there you go. But again, seriously, I truly want to thank you for taking the time for being on Into the Archives today, Robert.
It is my pleasure, and the correct terminology is follically challenged.
Film preservationist and aspiring comedian, Robert A. Harris. Robert's restorations and reconstructions on It's a Mad, 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 Mad World is available on Blu-ray from Criterion. The Godfather trilogy and My Fair Lady is available on Blu-ray from Paramount Home Entertainment. Williamsburg, A Story of a Patriot is available on DVD from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation on Amazon.com. Spartacus is available on Blu-ray from Universal, and Lawrence of Arabia is available on Blu-ray from Sony Pictures Home Entertainment. Next time on Into the Archives, we will speak with retired Vice President of Film Restoration, Preservation, and Asset Management for Universal Studios, Mr. Bob O'Neill. Listen by demand starting Friday, November 3rd. Into the Archives is copyrighted 2017 by Brody Productions. All rights reserved.
Distributed by National International Broadcasting.